Podcast. I'm your host, MGCovers. Greatly appreciate you tuning in to this episode. This is episode 24. We do this every Monday morning at 8 a.m. live on YouTube. But if you're watching this on Spotify or Apple, greatly appreciate you tuning into this podcast. We got a lot to cover for this podcast, a lot of cool things, very interesting things, some things I got wrong, and things I discovered over the weekend with regards to college football modeling. And I'll kind of give you a lineup of what we're going to talk about. College football reaction week 1, very fascinating. What I'm going to share with you, very fascinating. We're going to talk about year-to-date stats, combining those with current form with regards to building models. If you follow me for a long time, you know that generally not an advocate of incorporating year-to-date stats with your model, but there are exceptions, and I'll explain a couple models that I'm working on. We're talking a little bit about unexplained house edge. It's basically when the house wins, basically a bad beat. But unexplained house edge means the house will win more of those type games than you will, even if you're a winning handicapper. And then finally, we talk a little bit about the new coaching program that's going to launch here in a couple of weeks. Okay, so a lot to cover. College football reaction. Now, when I did this last year, I created what we call a subjective model. A subjective model would be a model not using stats, right? And a objective model would be a model that's statistically driven. Well, I experimented with this model some last year and then continued it this year, meaning there's a lot of, the margin of error is pretty huge in that, right? So originally when I created this model, what I thought would probably work is if you find teams, and I talked about this in the video last night, teams that are close via my model, I thought that, hey, if we just focus on home teams and then focus on the line movement, that will give us a huge edge. But in reality, it didn't really work out that way. A couple of ones that we lost were, I'm looking at this now, we actually didn't wager. But like, for example, and I actually made a video about this. Yeah, North Carolina, Minnesota was a great example. So we had those teams graded basically even. So if they were even, slight edge going towards Minnesota because they were home. North Carolina won that one. Another example would be Coastal, Jacksonville State. We had that game graded basically as at even. And then, of course, we handicap some other subjective things in there as well. Quarterback play, coaches, etc. So we gave a slight edge to Jacksonville State. And in essence, Coastal Carolina basically blew Jacksonville State out. However, what I discovered was that rather than trying to create a line, the better way to play this was simply play the top teams via this model and then play against the bottom teams via this model. And this, I'm super fascinated with this because this has been a paradigm shift in the way I approach handicapping, and meaning you don't really need to create a line. If your power rankings are good, meaning the stat that you're using equates to winning for the top teams and equates to losing for the bottom teams, you don't really need to make a line. And so what I did was I went back and I said, okay, I back tested this. So meaning I didn't play this live, but if you go back and we'll pull this up. So if you're watching this live, you can see it. Okay, so this should be on the screen now. So if you look over on the left-hand side, all these are the top teams via the model. Arkansas, Missouri, Oklahoma, Pittsburgh, Georgia, Tennessee. Now, again, another thing that I've talked about in college football, very difficult for teams to win by more than 3 touchdowns, right? And that's true if you take all of college football combined, meaning like if you look at the big sample size, yes, it's very difficult to beat a team by more than 3 touchdowns. However, with regards to modeling, all of these top teams via my model had to cover like huge numbers. I mean, huge numbers. and we'll go through these and just show you what I mean. So you take a look at the very first one you see on the screen there, Arkansas. Arkansas was the line was minus 50.5. Arkansas Pine Bluff was who they played. They won 70-0. Had to cover a 50.5 nut. Let's take a look at Missouri. Murray State. This was a close one. The line was minus 50. They covered it. They won 51-0. Let's take a look at another one. Oklahoma. They were 42.5. The spread was minus 42.5. They covered that. They won 51-3. So my point is, again, that's why it's important to have a creative mind, and like any type of bias that you have or what you think might actually work or not work, you have to actually do the research to find out whether or not that's true or not. Again, it is still difficult for teams to cover by more than a touchdown, but that's taking a huge sample size, meaning that's taking all of college football games combined year in, year out. But if you're looking at the quote better teams, these better teams do cover these big numbers. Georgia, Tennessee, Georgia and Clemson, Georgia only had like a 12.5 nut to cover. They easily covered that. Let's take a look at Tennessee. Tennessee played Chattanooga. The line was minus 39.5. So all these lines that I'm calling out for these top teams via my model, they had huge numbers. I would guess it probably averaged 40? Tennessee won 69-3. And the only teams that didn't cover, you look at their Ohio State, I think they missed it by 1. They played, let me look at this. Ohio State. Yeah, Akron. So Ohio State played Akron. Ohio State went crazy there in the second half. The line was 49, minus 49. They won 52-6. So they weren't that far off. Missed it by 3 points. Oregon. Let's take a look at I forgot who Oregon played. Idaho. Yeah, so they didn't play well. So the line was minus 49. Oregon won that one 24-14. But the point is, when you're creating a model, not even giving any importance to the line itself, just simply playing those top teams via the model. And how many was that total? Let's see. That was basically 14 teams. And it went 10-4. So no line creation, totally disregarding quote value and simply playing the top teams via the model. Went 10-4. Now, if you look there, LSU was a loss last night to USC, and that felt sort of like a 50-50 game. And the reason why I didn't calculate, if you see that on the screen, Notre Dame and Texas A&M, the way I do it via the model, I do this for all my models. If you got 2 top teams playing each other, it's just simply a no play. Super fascinating. And then if you look on the flip side of that, I played against all of these bad teams here. Meaning these are basically the teams I had ranked at the bottom of my power rankings. And you'll see a lot of these are FCS schools. Some of these are teams that have just gotten into FBS, Kennesaw State, Campbell Tech, Tennessee Tech, Bethune-Cookman, Furman. And some of these overlap with the top teams. I mean, a lot of these top teams were playing the bottom teams. Just playing against the bottom teams went 31-17 via the model. No line calculation, 31-17. So again, the paradigm shift that I've had in my philosophy in building models is that creating a line is not as important as you would think with regards to building models. And if you'd have talked to me probably 2 years ago, I would have said that's the only way to create a model. Meaning if the book's line is -5, and I said this before, how do you know that line -5 is a good line if you don't create a line yourself via your model. But the problem with creating a line yourself is it brings in so many variables, because the line that you create, however you calculate it, at the end of the day is simply an arbitrary number. It's an arbitrary number. So bringing an arbitrary number into a model creates a margin of error. And I showed that example in that video last night. The way that I calculated the line for Georgia was I had Georgia -10. The line was -12. So you look at that, you need at least 5 points margin. We have no value. It's a no play, creating a line. But then if you simply look at your power rankings, okay, Georgia is a quote top team via the model, it would be a play irregardless of the line. So super fascinating. It's very similar to if you've never created a model, and let's say you're listening to this podcast, conventional wisdom would say, okay, if I've never created a model, I need a lot of stats to create an effective model. But at the end of the day, that's really not true, because if you put one stat on top of another stat on top of another stat and calculate a line based on that, it's just not going to be effective. Meaning the way that I teach models and the correct way to build models, in my opinion, you need to find 1 or 2 stats, max 3, that correlate to winning, and conversely find 1 or 2 stats that correlate to losing. And some of my best models are 1 or 2 stats. And I'll give you an example of that. There was an old video, some of you might be able to find this on YouTube. Bill Parcells, he said this: if a team commits 1 turnover, if your team commits a turnover in NFL, you have like I can't remember the percentage chances of winning. It goes down. If you commit 2 turnovers in a game, it's the odds of you winning that are very slim. If you commit 3 turnovers, you're going to lose the game. It's like 80% in NFL. So the point is, with regards to turnovers in NFL, it wouldn't matter what passing yards are, how many rushing yards, what the time of possession is. If you turn the ball over, say your turnover ratio is, -2 compared to your opponent, you're going to lose the game. And that's a really good example with regards to modeling, because generally speaking, there's only going to be 1 or 2 stats that do correlate to winning. And that's really what your focus needs to be with regards to modeling. Because again, if you put a lot of stats into your model, it's just not going to be effective. And it's the same thing that I've changed my mind on with regards to how I'm approaching models now. It's like the time you spent creating a line actually might even hurt you. The focus should be finding those stats that correlate to winning, and then what criteria you're going to use for your top teams. Like, for example, for college football, there's 133 teams in college football. I think that's correct, FBS schools. So then trying to find a stat that correlates to winning or losing, and then figuring out what criteria you're going to use. And what I mean by that is, are you going to play the top 20 teams, the top 10 teams, or are you going to play against the bottom 30 teams, the bottom 20 teams? And that's basically what I've done with this model. And that's what you need to, that's where the focus should be. And it should be, because there'll come a point where it's not as effective. And what I mean by that is, let's say you start out, all right, I'm going to test the top 20 teams via my college football model. And you back test it and say it might hit 50%, testing the top 20. Then you might have to move it all the way up to the top 5 teams, meaning you're only going to play the top 5 teams via the model. And that should, if that model is good, should increase your win percentage. And so that's really where the focus needs to be, of figuring out how far up you need to go to increase your win percentage via that model. Super fascinating. But again, it's a paradigm shift, and it's just a faster way to create a model and a faster way to be profitable. Because again, once you introduce and start trying to create a line, now I still probably will create lines for my models, because I think on the client side, people that join the service, a lot of them, it's just simply for entertainment. So they want to see that line. If the line's minus 12, Georgia's minus 10, they actually want to see that as well. But again, super fascinating. And I think the thing I learned this weekend in regards to college football is that, these good teams do cover those big numbers. So to be anxious to see how this model progresses, because I really believe this might be a model, even though it's a quote subjective model, something that I can actually carry over into the rest of the season. Because I have a normal model that I'll introduce that's statistically driven. It's basically an objective model, and we'll introduce that in week 4. Super fascinating. All right. Next, I want to talk about year-to-date stats with regards to modeling. And this is something that, and again, I've changed so much here in the last 6 months. I have a stat model partner that I share information with. That's been a complete game changer with me. And then Eric, some of you guys know him. We started to share information as well. And even though I'm not talking about partnerships in this podcast, I think a lot of successful handicappers do have partners or people that they share information with. And I think it's a great resource. And I think that's, if I started over, I would try to find somebody that was on my level, or set up some type of partnership where we could exchange information, because that will expedite the process. And to give you one example, when the major tweak that I made to baseball, it was still my model, but my stat model partner came up with the sample size. And it was a sample size, and the way he constructed it, I would have never done it. I would have never thought of that. So what he suggested, I tried, I back tested, boom, it worked. And that was when we were all the way down to like 13 units. And then, since then the model went all the way up to well over 50 units. Had some regression here in the last week. I think I haven't ran the numbers, but we're still up about 40, 46 units year to date with Major League Baseball. But the point is that having that resource and using his intellect and being open-minded, I mean, that was a game changer. So, having partners and people you share information with is very important. All right, so I got off track there, but what I want to talk about, the year-to-date stats. Now, I talked about evolving. I came up with something last night for soccer that I think might potentially work. And that's incorporating year-to-date stats with like, quote, current form. And I'm also going to experiment that with NFL as well. And let me talk about why. If you use, say, and one of the difficult parts with NFL is you just don't have a big sample size, right? You only have 16 games in the season. So if your sample size is, say, the last 4, you're only using, quote, 4 games. And if you're using 2 stats, or 3 stats or whatever, it's just not a big sample size, right? So to help increase your accuracy, maybe, and I've back tested some of this, is what you want to use is maybe use a year-to-date stat, excuse me, year-to-date stat with NFL combined with a current form stat. Like, for example, let's say it's week 10 of the NFL season. So you're going to use a 10-game sample. That's your year-to-date. And for NFL, I usually use 4 games, the past 4 games. So whatever your model is, whatever stat you're using, you would add that stat up for 10 games. And then you would add up your model for the past 4 games. You would combine the year to date with the 4. And that would be your line, because, and we've talked about regression. Let's say if it's a really good team, right? But they've went on a small skid, having those year to date stats might increase the accuracy, right? Because at some point, if they're a really good team, they're going to, at some point, even though they've struggled maybe in 2 games, maybe they played 3 good opponents out of the last 4 games. At some point, they're going to regress back to, quote, being good, right? We talked about this in baseball. We played Oakland when Oakland was on a tear, right? even though they had a losing record, we played them maybe 5 out of 10 games when they went on this big run. But I think now they've regressed back to, quote, being a bad team. So same concept in using the year-to-date stat. And I've noticed this with soccer as well. Soccer is a very long season. So my thought is, and I just sent this model to my stat model partner. I think I posted this on Instagram. I'm not sure. But I think using year-to-date with current form for soccer is going to increase the accuracy. So, and again, you could do this with any sport. You can do it with basketball. You could do it with baseball and experiment with it. And again, this is me sort of changing my philosophy and building models. I think that might help to increase the accuracy, especially if you're struggling with the sport. Because that year-to-date stat, at some point, that team is going to, regress back to, quote, what they're doing year-to-date. And then combining that with current form, you get a good blend of predicting that particular outcome. Not saying it's going to work with every sport. And still, I do have models where I exclusively use current form, whether it's last 10 games, last 5 games, etc. But it's something definitely to keep in mind. And on this podcast, I do want to mention this. I've creating a new coaching program. The majority of it is going to be 70% of it is going to be online coaching, and 30% of it will be personal coaching. Is something that I'm super excited about. I launched this last year, had a lot of success up with it, but it was very time consuming. So I'm trying to blend those, and it was expensive. So I've tried to blend those two together. So the new coaching program is going to be a little bit less expensive. So there'll be a lot more people that will be able to afford it. Number one. So let's say you had some experience building models. You might be able to start halfway through the program and progress and maybe create, 2 stat models in 3 months. And then if you're a complete beginner, you have no clue how to import stats into Google Sheets, program will be perfect, be able to take you from a beginner level and to get you to creating a successful sports betting model. And if you want more information about that, this is going to launch on September the 12th, which would be not this Thursday, but next Thursday. And if you want more information about that program, there's a link where you can sign up on an email list. Link should be in this, wherever you're listening to this. If you scroll down to coaching program, or you can go to the website, MGCovers.com, and go over to the far right. I think there's a link that says stat model coaching. Click that and you can sign up for the email list. All right. Last thing we're going to talk about in this podcast is unexplained house edge. And if you follow me for any length of time, I'm absolutely obsessed with house edge, like obsessed with it. And what unexplained house edge means, or let me talk about what a bad beat. Most people know what a bad beat is, meaning like you're up 3-1, 8th inning, the other team comes back and wins. That happened to us yesterday with Toronto. Unexplained house edge is a concept that I've coined. It means that the house will win more of those games than you will long term. Now, most people would agree with that wager on sports. That's simply because they have more losses than they have wins. So if your sample size, if you have more losses than wins, then of course that makes sense. You'll have more bad beats than good beats, meaning games where you come back, meaning like you were down 1-3, but you came back. And if you understand normal distribution and probability, it's not going to be 50-50 each time, but it should be somewhat close. However, unexplained house edge, and this has happened my whole career, house always wins more of these than I do, even in a good sample size. For example, for the month of August, and I don't have the exact numbers in front of me. I think I put this out on Instagram. We were up 13 units. We're 58% in Major League Baseball. And I want to say it was 50. I want to say we had 43 wins and 31 losses. That's what it was. 43 wins and 31 losses. I think that's right. However, the number of, quote, bad beats we had, or comebacks, and I'm counting yesterday because we had one yesterday, the house had 6. So games where the house came back and won was 6. The number of times no, 8. This is what it was. 8th and 9th inning comebacks. The house had 6. We had 0. And there has to be some way to explain this, because it doesn't add up. And that's why I've coined the phrase unexplained house edge, because there's no way to statistically quantify it or to come up with a calculation that makes sense. And I remember, I'll give you several examples. NHL, maybe this was 3 years ago, we had 15 games that went to overtime. We lost 11 of those. 15 games go to overtime. We lost 11. And basically overtime in NHL is a 50-50 game. It's 3-on-3. I mean, you should, like, that is such an uneven distribution favoring the house than it is favoring yourself. Like, even if it was like, I don't know, maybe, yeah, closer to 50%, it would make sense. But interesting, phenomenal, unexplained house edge, and something that I have yet to accept in my career until I figure out why it is the way that it is. But super fascinating and constantly frustrated by it. But at the end of the day, nothing you can do about. House will always have the edge, hence the name Unexplained House Edge. All right, well, that's it for this podcast, episode 24. Greatly appreciate everybody tuning in live. Good luck this week, and we'll talk to you guys next Monday. Peace.